Okay, that's a good sign. And then I'm going to see if I can get the video up really quickly. Can everybody see that? I'll have to see if the link is going to work. Fingers crossed. Okay, is the video coming up for all of you? Oh, hang on. This is a Hudson Bay ad.
Not yet.
There we go. Can you see it?
The video?
Not yet here from
Okay.
you.
Then I'm gonna pause on that note because it doesn't seem to be working from my PowerPoint.
But sometimes there is some lag.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it's because I'm screen sharing the PowerPoint. Let me just try one.
No.
More. Here we go.
That.
Try to share this one. Let's see if that works.
Oh.
Okay.
$25 off.
Please ignore the, the ad.
Were you shopping?
Skip ad. There we go. No. Okay.
Danielle,
We
we don't
no
get
sound.
audio. Are you sharing, when you shared your screen, did you choose to share your audio if you didn't do that? Yeah,
No.
okay. Oh, so then stop sharing.
Yeah, it didn't give me that option.
It does, it shows, so when you click on screen share, on the bottom left hand side, you will see the chance to share your audio.
Lillian, you are brilliant.
I use Zoom a lot for my work.
Okay, can we ask if you're not speaking, can you mute? This one.
That I would have seen it had I not done. It allowed for me to work internationally. It allowed for me to understand other cultures and promote.
Okay. I'm getting something that's not what I want to be sharing, so I think I will, on behalf of the folks at the college, acknowledge that the college sits on the traditional lands of the Sianu First Nation, and want to recognize elders past, present, and emerging who have been the traditional caretakers and guardians of the land. So, kway everyone, Ninda Luisi Danielle White, Wadapagizi Nujokanik Oktahamguk. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you this evening from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Since time immemorial, they have been the guardians and caretakers of this land here in Eastern Ontario and West Quebec, where I now live and work. But what I said there in Mi'kmaq is that my roots are in Mi'kmaqi territory, and literally translated, that's the place where the sand blows in the land across the water, and which some of you will remember was a small community on the west coast of Newfoundland called St. George's. So Apsalaji, Walalio, and thank you all for being with us tonight. The session we wanted to organize for this reunion builds on a conversation we had at the 2019 reunion in person with Corey Wilson, who's a year 14, and I. And we thought it would be a good opportunity to have some truth-telling and discussion and reflection around an aspect of Canada's history that we didn't really talk a whole lot about at the college. And hopefully through our conversation here tonight to continue that dialogue, but maybe also broaden the discussion to the international context. And so I'm really glad to have my fellow year here as a panelist, Jarn Johansson, who was, I think, the first Greenlandic student to attend Pearson College, and Catherine Anderson, who's my 0 year, also from Newfoundland and Labrador. And so maybe what we could do to start the conversation is I'll turn to each of you for a brief introduction, maybe talk a quick round about who we are, where we come from, our connection to the issues of Indigenous rights and reconciliation, and how it links to our own kind of lived experience or work or expertise or whatever you want to talk about. And then maybe we could do a second round, dive a little deeper, and hopefully leave lots of time for questions and open discussions. So Jarn, did you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, as Danielle introduced me, I'm
Jarn, you're on mute, I think.
No. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm Jørgen Johansen. I'm from Greenland. and in Greenland we are 89% Inuit, and we are by many considered the most advanced form for indigenous peoples' self-governance in the world. I went to Pearson, and it was a great, maybe the greatest experience of my life. We were all instilled with the purpose to go out and do something positive for the societies and nations where we lived. So of course I started studying political science following my experience at PC. I went to Carleton University, and after that to McGill. And during my summer vacations, I worked for the Greenland Youth Council. And in that context, I came into the issue or with the issues of indigenous people's rights. I actually made my first public speech ever some 28 years ago. And it so happened I was lucky enough to be able to present the conclusions of the second World Indigenous Youth Conference. And so I got to make my first ever speech at the Working Group for Indigenous Populations, as it was called at the time, in Geneva. Following that, I have been involved in politics in Greenland. I was elected to the Greenland Parliament in 1999, and I held 4 different cabinet minister portfolios over the years. In 2008, I stopped at doing national politics and became the CEO of a government-owned venture capital company called Greenland Venture. And following that, we moved to South Greenland, and somehow I got into local politics. And in 2013, I was elected the mayor of South Greenland. In that position, I served for 4 years. And after that, I took on my own businesses again. And today I'm living with the dream and aspiration of making an investment fund here in Greenland to further the growth and ensure that the indigenous peoples are also involved in the investments and the necessary developments that need to happen here in Greenland in order for us to become a fully independent nation. And of course, that requires us to be economically self-sustained. So that is one of the main tasks that we are working with here in Greenland. Maybe that's a short and very brief introduction. I'm the father of 4 children. The oldest is 28, and the youngest one just turned 12. So I have been quite busy.
Thanks, Jarn. Catherine, over to you.
Thanks, Danielle, and so nice to see you and meet you virtually, and recording in progress. And great to so nice to see some of my fellow years and second years. My name's Catherine Anderson. I'm in Inuk from Nunatsiavut in Northern Labrador. I'm year 19 from Pearson, and like it was a phenomenal experience. Recently did an interview with the Telegram, which is or Saltwire, local and news or a regional newspaper in Atlantic Canada. And one of the questions was talk about one of the experiences in your life that was really life-changing. And for sure, I immediately thought of Pearson. So I have, I guess, since Pearson, I've been working, well, I went to university, did my undergrad in linguistics, and then did a lot of work around language revitalization in Northern Labrador. Worked as director of the Tungasa Cultural Center there for about 5 years, where a lot of the work focused on cultural activities, like I said, language revitalization. I was director of the Cultural Center when the Labrador Inuit Association transitioned, or our land claims agreement was signed, and we transitioned to self-government. So we also have self-government in Nunatsiavut. So I was there as director when we transitioned to that period. I guess after my 5 years as director, I took a leave of absence to go back to school again. And after that, decided to stay in St. John's. I did my MBA at Memorial University. And about 6 years ago, got a job with the university as a special advisor to the president on Indigenous affairs, where a lot of the work really focused on providing leadership and coordination around Indigenous affairs within the university. So engaging with Indigenous communities throughout Newfoundland and Labrador, but also looking at ways to enhance the recruitment and retention of Indigenous students. And just a month and a half ago, what are we? About a month and a half ago, was appointed as the first Vice President Indigenous at Memorial University. And still carrying on a lot of those same responsibilities, but with the additional role of one of the 7 vice presidents at Memorial. So one of the big things we've done recently at the university is approve a strategic framework for indigenization, which really provides a number of recommendations to indigenize the academy in terms of academic programming, but also looking at our governance and our policies and practices in administrative units across the institution as well. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks, Catherine. And so maybe I can tell you a little bit of my my story and my background. And for those of you who knew me at the college, you're probably surprised to learn that I'm a member of the Qalipu First Nation. And I'm of mixed Mi'kmaq and European ancestry. And, you know, the reasons that I didn't strongly identify with that aspect of my background at the college are complicated, and a lot of them are tied to sort of, you know, colonization and racism and the interesting history of Newfoundland's place in Canada, because as you may or may not know, the country we now call Canada was formed in 1867, and one of the first acts of Parliament was the Indian Act, which is one of the most probably repressive legislative instruments in our history. But Newfoundland was a British colony, and then a self-governing British colony, and then in 1949 joined the Dominion of Canada. And at the time of Confederation, in 1949, the federal government didn't recognize any of the Indigenous peoples in Newfoundland, including the Inuit and the Innu in Labrador, nor the Mi'kmaq on the island of Newfoundland. So it's interesting because right around the time I left for the college, it was sort of the start of a political and cultural revitalization in my community. So it sort of evolved kind of over for me in the years since that time. And ultimately in 2008, my community and the 8 other Mi'kmaq communities on the island formed the Qalipu First Nation. Qalipu means caribou in our language, and were registered under the Indian Act, which is an interesting choice. As Catherine mentioned, you know, in Nunatsiavut, they went the self-government route and negotiated a land claim and modern treaty and self-government agreement. On the island, they opted to form a landless band. So we don't have a reserve under the Indian Act, but we do have Indian status and are registered. And so that's been an interesting journey. And when I think about sort of my family and my family history and why people didn't identify as Indians in 1949, a lot of us, have mixed Mi'kmaq. They were French Indians on the West Coast, and so they came from Unama'ki, which is Cape Breton, intermarried and allied with the Acadians. And while Newfoundland was always part of Mi'kmaq territory, our ancestors would cross the Gulf of St. Lawrence in birch bark canoes. In 1949, I think about how my grandfather's life would have been different if he had been registered under the Indian Act then, as opposed to when our family gained status in 2008. And, it's instructive of the Indian Act and what it was then, but he was a World War II veteran. Coming home, he probably would have lost his veterans benefits because most First Nations veterans didn't get what others were entitled to. He would have lost the right to vote because under the Indian Act, First Nations didn't gain the right to vote in Canada until 1960. His 8 children, including my mom, probably would have been carted off to residential school. And we all know the horrific legacy of the residential schools. So when I think about my identity, I also think about some of the privilege, a lot of the privilege that comes with that because of the unique historical circumstances. And I'm really thrilled that Marg and Marks are here tonight, because I think a real turning point for me was actually the summer right after we graduated from the college. So at the end of 1992, Marks at the time, if you don't know Marks, everybody knows Margaret, but Marks had been a teacher at the college and left to form an NGO that was based in Victoria, focusing on interfaith education. And right after we all left in May and we boarded the school buses, he was hosting a conference of teachers at the college. And so a number of us stayed behind to volunteer. And I remember going into up to their house, and there were 2 Mi'kmaq elders there from Cape Breton. And I remember walking in and sitting down with them, and I just felt like home. I felt like I'd never met these women before, but they felt like my aunties from back home. And, that was the beginning. And then the following summer, Marks had organized the Peace Bus, which took a group of Indigenous, non-Indigenous, and youth from other linguistic or ethnic minorities in Canada. There were 2 buses, one started in Victoria, one started in Newfoundland. We visited a First Nations community in every province. We stayed there for about 5 or 6 days. We're kind of immersed in the culture. And so I was on the Eastern wing as sort of a camp counselor. And it was my first real immersion in Mi'kmaq culture. We actually made a couple of visits to Mi'kmaq, Con River in central Newfoundland, and then Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick, and on to 2 Algonquin communities. And it was really the start of a journey for me. And over the years, I've been learning more about the culture, starting to learn the language. That was my COVID project, and passing it on to my daughters. And they're going to kill me because both of them, I think, are listening in. I can see my daughter's iPhone. They're visiting my mom in Newfoundland right now. They said, "Oh, we're not going to turn on our cameras because we're shy." So I put together a couple of pictures that I can show you all. I don't know if you can see that. Did the screen share work? Yes, excellent. Okay. But this is the last powwow we were able to attend in our home community. It's now the biggest powwow in Atlantic Canada. Some of you met Amy and Laura at the reunion. So there's Amy, who's a fancy shawl dancer. Laura is a master beader and has her own social enterprise. And this is some beadwork. The photo at the top is why the community is called the place where the sand blows. That's one of the beaches near home. And just to maybe the picture in the center is a piece of beadwork that I did for a friend who's putting together a memorial at Carleton University in the School of Social Work to honor the 215 children who were found at the Kamloops Residential School in the unmarked graves earlier this summer, which I know made news around the world, and some of you may have heard of. So there, I've embarrassed my kids, so that's good. And then really quickly, just in terms of how this relates to my career. So like many of us, I started off in international relations because that's what we all thought we were going to do when we left Pearson, or a lot of us. And after that summer of 1993 with the Peace Bus, I started to slowly shift my focus in history and political science more to domestic policy and domestic issues, and joined the public service in 1998. And in 2000, I moved over to the ministry responsible for Indigenous affairs, which has had 6 different names in the 20 years I've worked there. It's the same department. And in 2017, I was asked to head up the newly created Reconciliation Secretariat, which was set up by the government following the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to coordinate the implementation of the calls to action across government, so among government agencies, and also to establish a formal co-development process and a formal framework for the relationship with each of the 3 distinct Indigenous groups in Canada, so with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And we established a process where they meet annually with the Prime Minister, several times a year with key cabinet ministers, and quarterly with senior officials to move the agenda forward in a much more equal and nation to nation type relationship. And so I was there for a couple of years, and then in 2018 they split up the department I was working in into Crown Indigenous Relations, and then the new Indigenous Services Canada, which has a mandate to actually work towards its own obsolescence by transferring the design and delivery and jurisdiction over services to Indigenous communities. And so I went to work there, and then just in April of this year, I became an assistant deputy minister in the regional operations sector, which was a switch from having done policy. Although I'd say policy, 99% of my work is really around relationship management, relationship building. And there I'm responsible for we have 7 regional offices, south of 60, so in the provinces that provide services to First Nations. And we also provide sort of national policy oversight on housing, water, infrastructure, emergency management, and individual affairs. So that's kind of where I am and what I'm doing. And maybe we could just pause there and see if there are any questions, or if Jorn or Catherine, you wanna do a round 2, and if there's anything you want to add. And I should say, if don't be shy and feel free to put questions in the chat if you like. Or I can keep talking. It's up to you guys.
Well, maybe I can elaborate a little bit. Greenland went from a colonial status, which we had with Denmark until 1979, when the Greenland Home Rule was introduced, and the Greenland Home Rule was really a limited form of self-government. That limited form of self-government was revised while I was the Minister for Self-Government. And in 2009, it was inaugurated, where Greenland went from home rule to self-government. And in real terms, it means that we govern all areas of politics or policy making in Greenland, except for foreign policy, which is a joint thing with Denmark. Denmark still has the defense and military of Greenland, but in contrast to many of the land claims and self-government arrangements that you have in Canada, in Greenland, we never made a land claim settlement. So in 2009, when we achieved self-governance, we also achieved the right, the ownership to all land and subsurface rights. So in terms of that is very different. We have a self-government arrangement with Denmark, but we haven't sold our land, so to speak. And I don't believe that we will ever come in a situation where majority of Greenlanders would enter into a land claims settlement situation, because it really defines who we are here in Greenland. And of course, we are quite different from many other indigenous peoples, as our mother country, so to speak, is 3,500 kilometers away. And we are our own entity on our island, our nation. And the independence movement, or the aspirations to become even more independent, changes over time. Sometimes the political winds blows for more cooperation with Denmark, and sometimes there's a real move and a real some real work gets done on moving towards even more independence. And it's a slow and tedious process, but I also think that the good thing is that it's a peaceful process, where we, through the diplomatic channels, are able to negotiate some agreements that will allow Greenland eventually to enter the global arena as an independent nation, and I certainly hope it will happen in our lifetime.
Thanks, Jorn. Catherine, is there anything you wanted to add? I see Benoit put a question in the chat about the Reconciliation Action Plan, and I posted a link to it in the Facebook group. I know Angie Bain, who I guess wasn't able to join us, was part of the committee that developed that, but the link is there if you want to go and look at it. I mean, it's interesting. I only remember, you know, we were at the college, so Yarn and my year started the fall of 1990, which Canadians will remember as the Oka crisis, the summer right before, where there was the Canadian government and the Quebec government sent in the police and then the military to remove Mohawk protesters from who were occupying a site where the municipality of Oka wanted to build a golf course on a traditional burial ground. And it sparked a movement across the country of protests and blockades. And yet, you know, I remember arriving at the college, and it was also the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Gulf War, and there were so many other you know, at the end of apartheid in South Africa, that, you know, and I think as Canadians, we were so interested you know, in learning from all of you about your culture and your traditions, that it wasn't really a focus, you know, during our time at the college. And it's nice to see that that's evolved now, and it really is a central you know, element of the college, and some of the guiding principles around you know, how the college conducts itself and its relationship with the local First Nations. So that's good to see. I see, Paula, you asked. Yes, I think there was a film actually made about the Oka crisis. And Laureen Pindera, who's, I can't remember what year, but a Pearson graduate before us, had been year 3, 4, was a journalist on the ground at the time, and was involved in that as well. There it is. Oh, and look at that. Benoit's already posted the link. And I don't know if it's GeoBlock, but the National Film Board of Canada has all of their films available online for free to stream. Okay. Sorry, Catherine, I was going to jump. Oh, there's Mark's. We go to Mark's, and then I'll jump back to Catherine.
Yeah, but I may just say a couple of things. One, it was that Oka crisis that led to a smaller Peace Bus project, organized largely by Patrice Brodeur from year 6. It was almost a form of reconciliation at the time, where he gathered young people, and they went from First Nations community to First Nations community. And it was with the work in our interfaith work that he was on the board. He proposed to do it in 1993. And 1993 was a special year. You know, United Nations has a special year every year. And that year, it may not be the only time they've done it, but it was the year
Mhm.
of the world's Indigenous peoples. That's one thing. And listening to the comments from Greenland and Newfoundland, I realized that colonialism was mostly very, very bad. But it was interesting. Margaret and I spent 4 years in Uganda, and by the time the British got there, they'd already done something like in Greenland. They were not, the British were not allowed to own land
Mhm.
by their own
That's right.
colonial position.
Mhm.
And so we awoke to the United World College concept by actually teaching at a school, and dare I say it was residential, but it was residential by local approval, where people from all the tribes of Uganda came to the one school. And so they weren't, it wasn't assimilation, it was preparation for nationhood in the midst of many peoples having many smaller bits of land. So it was a complicated country because it would have, you know, let's say 25 tribes of people. But these several schools have been set up by the British, oddly, but eventually run by their own people, which recognized that this was a way of creating a nation or a supranation over their kind of tribal nations. So I might just mention that because the British never owned land in Uganda, but they did in Kenya, as we know.
Thanks, Marks. And I always found it interesting. I remember in IB history, you know, we learned about colonization in Africa and other countries, and yet I, you know, very rarely talked about what was happening or had happened in our own backyard here in Canada. Catherine, I'm going to let you jump back in.
Sure. And I think that's such an important point, what you just said, Danielle, is, you know, I think back to when I first came to Pearson, and I attended Pearson on an ESSL scholarship for an Indigenous student for Canada. So it was and I wasn't one of the, I didn't attend as a representative of the province, but it was this national scholarship. And I think the scholarship was, in one place it was identified as a national Aboriginal student, but in another place it was a piece done for the newspaper, I think the Pearson College, one of the newsletters or something. And I was profiled as one of the students, and it said I was a student, a First Nation student. And oh, Annalisa, hi, I just saw you join it. So good to see you.
I'm still at work. I'm going to try to juggle both, but I really wanted to listen in on this. I'm glad it's being recorded. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Hi, everyone.
And so I didn't even know the difference. And I think back on that and it's like, wow, because for me, coming from a small community in Northern Labrador, I knew Inuit, and I knew, you know, there were Innu communities near me, and I knew them as Innu communities. But these umbrella terminologies for Indigenous peoples in the country, I wasn't even familiar with it. So I didn't even, you know, First Nations, it was like, okay, fine. But we didn't learn these things in school. We didn't learn about the colonization of Canada. We didn't learn, and I think back to a guest speaker we had at the university a few years ago, Shawneen Pete, and she talked, you know, she asked these questions to the audience. When did you first learn about Indigenous peoples in this country? You know, was it in junior high? Was it in senior high? Did you learn about Indigenous peoples in university? And a lot of people did not, you know, when she asked the question about learning about Indigenous peoples in elementary school, junior high, senior high, not very many people put up their hands. And she said, we have all been structurally denied the opportunity to learn about Indigenous peoples because it's just not in our curriculum. And I think about that for my own educational experience too. I mean, I knew about my community and my family history, but just not the broader perspective. And I think, you know, we have a lot of work to do there.
Mhm. It's very true. I think, you know, and that's the first step of reconciliation, is really that, you know, the truth aspect, and not being afraid of the things we didn't know, and accepting that a lot of the things we were taught are not true. So interesting. I know Jose wants to jump in. A couple of years ago in some of my work, I had the opportunity to travel to Australia in 2019 and to Ecuador a couple of years before that. And I was struck by, you know, some of the really powerful similarities in how colonization was experienced in those countries, but also some of the differences. And I know, Jose, I believe you're working with the UN, or have been, and maybe we'll turn it over to you for a few comments.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, the organizers. Is at least for me, it's a really important topic, and it's so nice to see many of my friends, colleagues, and Mark. Just for you to know, I am from Ecuador, as Danielle mentioned, year 18. And let me complement and also bring another dimension. I mean, as you mentioned, Danielle, the situation in Ecuador is quite different. 40–50% of the population is indigenous. And fortunately for me, my father, who never left Ecuador, has always been working with indigenous populations. So I was faced with indigenous situations in different parts of the country throughout my childhood. But the funny thing is that while living in Ecuador, it was extremely hard for me to see the type of discrimination and racism that we have within our own culture. But it was in Pearson College during my first project week that we went to my first Indian reservation. I don't know if any of you went with me, but we went to Washington State, to the Olympic Mountains, and we did a couple of projects with Jean Godin during that week. And after that experience, I decided to get more involved in indigenous issues in North America, and I joined Rediscover International and the program we had at Pearson College for several years, and I have the opportunity to be a summer camp leader in the area where Max and Mark were living in interior of BC. But when I graduated, or when I finished Pearson College, I decided not to go to university, but to do a 3-year option in the Amazon jungle. And it was an extremely different reality, because there we were talking about how we deal with development issues in order to ensure livelihoods, education, and health according to the needs of native communities. And the project that I was supporting was a project led by indigenous people in the upper Napo River in the Amazon jungle in Ecuador. After that, I also had the opportunity to bring a couple of my Indian colleagues from the jungle to Canada. The college sponsored them to be part of Rediscover International, and for them to see what is the experience of rediscovery versus what they were doing in the Amazon, which was extremely eye-opening for them. But many years passed, and in, I think it was in 2003 or 2004, the first time I arrived in Brazil, where I am currently located. Then I was working with development issues, and I was the national director for Terre des Hommes, the Netherlands. And the projects I was supporting were taking place in the reserves in Brazil, completely different from the reserves in Canada. Xingu, for example, a major reserve in the middle of the deforestation of Mato Grossos, where a couple of wise or not so wise anthropologists brought different tribes together in order to make sure they will survive. So then again, another dimension, how we make sure the rights of these populations are maintained and respected among a Brazilian society that didn't want to have that reserve in the middle of a rich plantation kind of region. And then many years later, when I joined UNHCR 15 years ago, I face a different reality. What happened with the indigenous people that are part of an armed conflict, that they are part of those of a warfare that is not theirs. In Colombia, for example, in the province of Chocó, which borders Panama and Colombia, you have a population that is probably 60% Afro-Colombia and 30% indigenous. And they suffer from the guerrilla movements and from the paramilitaries that accuse them to be part of one or the other entity. And part of the situation there is that by being considered part of one of or the other groups, they end up being killed, kidnapped, raped in public events. How do you deal with that? How do you reconstruct leadership and maintain the basic principles of humanity among the population that is in between a warfare? And again, and I will finish with this, here in Brazil right now with the Venezuelan population, refugees from Venezuela, out of the 260,000 people that we have here, we have a population of around 6,000 indigenous people from 5 ethnic groups. Many of them were displaced many years ago because of the construction of a dam in the Orinoco in Venezuela or other type of projects. And they are here because the subsidies that they used to receive are gone. And they are nomads, and their culture is partly gone. So we have people that arrive in one location, and right now they are everywhere in the country, trying to survive, begging, using the children to get food in many locations like Brasilia, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte. And what is our role as society, not only to integrate, to facilitate the process of socioeconomic integration in the country, but also to ensure they are able to take part of their own decisions, to be leaders or their own community, how youth can continue to have a voice and in the construction of their future and the decision of their community. So I stop here, but I wanted to bring this development and also emergency perspective to the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jose. And I guess somewhat related to that, Tanya had a really excellent question in the chat that I'd like to turn to maybe Yarn and Catherine to weigh in on. But she said, what do you wish an ally would know that they usually don't? And I don't know if that's a term used elsewhere, but in North America, there is a growing movement of allies, people who are concerned about Indigenous issues, want to support Indigenous causes. But it can sometimes be a source of conflict as well. And I know, Catherine, it's probably something you're familiar with in the university context. So maybe I'll turn to you first. But what do you wish an ally would know that they usually don't when it comes to these issues?
It's a good question. I think it's really hard to say because I think everyone is different and people are coming to this with different experiences, different knowledges. One of the things we focus on at the university is around cultural humility. So rather than talking about cultural sensitivity or cultural awareness, those things are important, but also it's understanding where you're coming from, the assumptions that you're coming with, and and really challenging those assumptions. So that's one of the things that we talk about.
Thanks. Yarn, did you want to add? And if not, I can jump in.
You're still on mute, Yarn.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a very good question from Tanya, because maybe I would point at language, the importance of Indigenous peoples' languages and the development of these. I know from our own situation here in Greenland that we wouldn't be the same if we hadn't retained our Greenlandic Inuktitut dialect. And that really is the essence of us being able to tell our own history and raise our own children using our own language, ensuring that they learn their own language and are schooled in their own language. That is really one of the backbones of our culture. And I think that much more attention should be paid to the fact and the importance of making sure that Indigenous people's languages survive. And the other point is that we have been talking about gender equality for many years, I know, but especially in former colonized settings, such as those that most Indigenous peoples endure, the importance of women. Indigenous women really form the backbone of Indigenous people's survival. And to use Greenland as an example, we also see that in Greenland, women are probably much more strong and resilient and wiser than men, because if you look at those who finish their education and over a whole cross section of different issues, a lot more females finish their education and thereby are in a position to bring forward and work for the needs of the people in a much higher capacity than the men are. I think we often overlook the fact that the men are actually the weaker links in former colonized countries.
Very true. And it's one of the things I know, particularly in North America, that a lot of First Nations societies were matriarchal and matrilineal, and that's something that was erased through colonization. Just to build on what the others have said on Tanya's question, what would I want allies to know? I think there are a couple of things. One is about the diversity of within and among Indigenous nations. First Nations are not Inuit. Within First Nations, Mi'kmaq are not the same as Algonquins or the same as Coast Salish. And so I noticed that I just saw Hippo's comment in the chat about, integrating Indigenous culture into everyday PC life. There is no such thing as Indigenous culture, that each nation is distinct, and part of it is understanding the land you're on and the cultures and protocols in the area where you are. I think that, two other quick points, and they're related. Two is that, kind of this history of colonization and of trauma is in the living memory of a lot of people. And if we think about it, the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. So 4 years after I graduated from Pearson College, which is quite astonishing, right? When you think of it, and most Canadians don't know that. So it's a bit of understanding, when you're working with Indigenous peoples, their own trauma, their own experience. I have a colleague at work, a good friend of mine, who's a few years younger than me, and her dad went to the Kamloops Indian Residential School, where they just discovered the 215 bodies of children who were buried there, and across Canada that number is now up over 6,000. So the experiences are real and they're raw for a lot of people. And so I mean, this is something in the work that I do when we think about policy. It has to be trauma informed, absolutely. But I think the other point I'd want to make is we also need to emphasize strengths-based approaches, that Indigenous people are incredibly resilient and have endured a lot, and our cultures have survived and thrived despite all of the terrible things that have happened in the past. And so, when we think about, and I apply it to my own, field that I work in. So we do a lot of, funding of services, and we want to close the gap, and we want to improve educational outcomes, and we want to get to better health outcomes. And those indicators, while that's all really important work, it focuses on the deficits, on the things that aren't going well in communities. And I think you know, the answer is also in strengths-based approaches. And I'm just going to show you a quick slide that's pretty meaningful to me, but it's Erowamak is a Mi'kmaq concept that was actually, I mentioned the two ladies I met in Marg and Mark's living room. One of them was the late Professor Medina Marshall, and she and her husband, who's still living in Mi'kmaq, elder Albert Marshall, came up with this idea of Etowaptamak, two-eyed seeing. And it's, you know, learning to see with one eye the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and learning to see with the other eye, you know, the strengths of Western ways of knowing and being, and then learning to see with both eyes. And Indigenous peoples have been doing this really, you know, since first contact. But it's something that I think allies need to start to understand as well, this idea, this ability to see with both eyes, and to recognize you know, the strengths of Indigenous cultures, of ways of knowing and being, and ways of governance and ways of organizing society. And it's something we see in the policy world. And a quick example, in 1993, the Mi'kmaq and Nova Scotia negotiated a sectoral self-government agreement. So they didn't want the full, you know, self-government agreement, which takes years and millions of dollars to negotiate. They identified that for them, the most important thing to take control of now was education. And so they drew down jurisdiction. They set up their own educational authority, the Mi'kmaq Ginawatwe Education Authority. And today, 30 years later, Indigenous Mi'kmaq students in Nova Scotia have a higher high school completion rate than the provincial average. And that's because they, you know, developed Mi'kmaq immersion programs. They educated students, they taught math and literature and science and social studies, but from a Mi'kmaq worldview. And, you know, the results speak for themselves. I've gone on way too long, but I know I
would actually like to really remark something.
Yeah.
Because you're focusing so much on the differences between the different Indigenous people within Canada. Don't. Look beyond that. Okay, I do understand that it is extremely important for every culture to have their very distinct own way of life. But Pearson College can go far beyond that, because it's an outreach point for every Indigenous people within Canada to reach out to the rest of the world. Because all you're doing at the moment, you're very much concerned with internal Canadian affairs. Okay, Pearson College goes beyond that. It's not just internal Canadian affairs. And one of the things that struck me while I lived in Canada, and I lived in Canada a lot longer than just PC, because I stayed, like, in total, I lived for a little more than 10 years in Canada, is all Indigenous people I was in contact with have extremely rich visual cultures. They're distinctly different. All of them have their different styles, but all of them have distinctly visual cultures that are very, very much connected with Earth, with all living things on Earth. And that is something that is very, very separate from most Western cultures, because we have become a lot more abstract in many, many ways. We have become more separated from our surroundings. So one of the things that struck me reading in the background, the action plan, is there is nothing about art in there. Absolutely nothing. That is a way to connect Canadian Indigenous cultures, in plural, all the different cultures, with the students at the college, and through that, with the whole world. Because, like, I have been watching what is happening in the Vancouver art scene, especially the Indigenous art scene in Vancouver, and there is huge development there. There has been fantastic things happening there in the last 10 years. So if you manage to create a Pearson College specific IB art program that incorporates Indigenous art into the teaching process, you would be able to reach out to the whole world, and you don't have to focus on the differences anymore. Create the mosaic. That's the Canadian thing. Create the mosaic. That's the one thing that is so different about Canada in comparison to every other country I know. Canada is strong in the mosaic. but it has left out the Indigenous culture so far. So try that at Pearson. Just try.
Catherine or Yarn, did you want to respond, or I can weigh in?
I think it's a great point, Hippo. You know, in terms of art, I would just I would also argue the fact that because Indigenous cultures are based in place, that I think that has to be the starting point. So where Pearson is based, you know, we Danielle, thank you for doing the land acknowledgement. I think that's really important. And again, it's place-based.
Mhm.
So I think that's where it starts. I think there needs to be a broader, you know, conversation about colonization, about reconciliation in a national context. And I think because it's Pearson, you're right, there needs to be this international context as well. But I think it's not about looking at, you know, it is important to recognize the diversity of Indigenous cultures, but I think most importantly, we need to recognize the place that Pearson College is in.
Mhm.
And starting with that culture, and then we go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think, you know, I think the IB generally, the curriculum should be looked at through that lens of the Indigenous experience around the world and the experience of colonization, not just art, but history and literature and, you know, various aspects of the curriculum. But I also think, as Catherine said, you start with place-based, and for Indigenous people, that connection to the land, the protocols around the land predate Canada. I mean, this idea of the Canadian mosaic was sort of Trudeau Senior, and you know, started in really the 60s and 70s. It's not the origins of Canada as Indigenous peoples understand them. And so, you know, I think, and when it comes to art, I agree, I saw in the comments, it can be a great unifier, but I think we also have to recognize, you know, for many Indigenous people, Indigenous arts have also been, you know, exploited and appropriated. And so again, it's something that you have to proceed, I would say, with, you know, with a great deal of caution and sensitivity, and beginning in the place where you are. And you know, that comes from, you know, 20 plus years of working with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. And the first thing, you know, we talk about is, you know, their connection to place, the distinctness, you know, distinctiveness of their nation, and they see themselves as nations. Just as at Pearson College, we saw ourselves as, you know, Canadians and Germans and Ecuadorians. Like there are 90 Indigenous language groups in Canada, and while they may have some cultural similarities, they want to be treated as distinct nations. So it's, you know, as someone who works in government and in policy, it's certainly, you know, makes our work complicated, but it also makes it very, very rich and very interesting. I know, Tanya, I know you work in this field as well, as an expert in Indigenous languages, and I just want to give you the opportunity if you'd like to weigh in. And sorry, I'm trying to read the chat and pay attention at the same time. So I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
I've been working with Indigenous endangered languages for the last 25 years, but I don't think I should be taking the space from the Indigenous alumni, as I am not Indigenous myself. So I'd be happy to chat with anyone privately. I don't think this is my place. This is your place.
I did just want to highlight, though, for folks, your work and your expertise in this field, because I think there may be, actually, Paula had a question in relation to language and learning about pronunciation, and is there a guide? There's a very good land acknowledgement guide that was put out by the Canadian Association of University Teachers. I can find the link and I'll post it to the group, which at least tells you the territory. The language is always tricky. And I know I've done a lot of, when I used to work in communications, we were doing events all over the country, and I was always trying to, you know, the night before an event, find a speaker of that particular language who could help coach us through the correct pronunciation of places and greetings. But it's quite diverse, and a lot of the languages in Canada, there are very few speakers left, I think, of the 90 languages. I have the numbers, but the vast majority are endangered languages at the moment. So, but I will see what I can find, and Tanya may have some ideas on that as well. I don't, if you want to, oh, Yarn has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's an interesting point that Hippo just made, but I also think that one thing we have to remember that most of the Indigenous students that go to Pearson College, we come from very small communities. And one common thing that probably is, regardless of where we come from, is the fact that we all have some role models that we aspire or get inspired by. And I think that the Wednesday afternoons when we were at the college, when we were introduced to different topics at Max Bell Hall, those really provided inspiration for me on a very large range of different topics. And especially I remember Bill Wilson. He came and gave a very, very strong and provocative speech. But as an Indigenous person, I walked out of Max Bell Hall that day 2 inches higher. So I think Pearson-related role models could also be something that future Indigenous young students could benefit from, and maybe we could all contribute to that.
That's an excellent point. It's funny, we were talking on the weekend at one of the sessions about some of the changes at the college, and I remember that Bill Wilson presentation very clearly. And I remember Angie, who I was hoping would be here tonight, but I guess couldn't make it. Angie is a First Nations student from British Columbia, and we were saying how, at the college there didn't appear to be the notice board anymore in the cafeteria. You know how we'd all put our trays away, and then you'd read the notice board on the way out, and it would be like people nailing their manifesto to the wall. And not just for events, but people would actually use it as a forum to express themselves. And I remember after that Bill Wilson presentation, Angie writing a very powerful essay almost and putting it on the notice board about, the points that she disagreed with. And I see Benoit's just highlighting Evan Adams. So Evan Adams is now actually one of my colleagues at Indigenous Services Canada, and he's been a great addition to our team. And before he was a medical doctor, he was also an actor. So if you've ever seen, oh my God, the name of the movie escapes me. But
was it Smoke Signal?
Thank you, Smoke Signals. Yes, you can see Evan in his younger days in that movie. I just had a complete mind freeze. Thank you, Catherine. So anyone else? I don't know if I've missed someone in the chat who had a question. Feel free to chime in. Go ahead, Jaylene.
It's kind of a question, I guess.
Or a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying very hard to be a listener and a learner in this situation in Canada. And friends of mine who are Indigenous and who are musicians or working in the music industry have shared that they really appreciate it when people highlight Indigenous talent, and particularly, in their world, music. And they shared, of course, it's important to listen to the historical stories and to acknowledge pain and grief and to learn, but they really felt strongly that they wanted us, you mentioned the strength-based thing, and they wanted us to understand how much and celebrate how much Indigenous people can bring to our society and do bring to our society. And I just thought that was very striking, and just to hear from them, just to hear them share in that respect. And just, they were talking about, you know, programmers, in particular radio programmers who were not just playing, not just creating Indigenous playlists, but actually integrating Indigenous artists in regular playlists and highlighting Indigenous artists in a general context, not just as that special Indigenous thing. So it's not really a question, but a comment that I appreciated from them.
Thanks, Daleen. Any other thoughts from either Catherine or Jorn?
Maybe it's important also to acknowledge the fact that the Indigenous peoples live under very, very different circumstances. Some are on the verge of being extinct. And some of us live in a very peaceful world where we are able to negotiate our way to better results. But regardless of wherever we live, we have the United Nations as our common denominator, and I also think that it's important to acknowledge the fact that a lot of nations have what do you call it, subscribed to or acknowledge the United Nations a document on Indigenous people's rights, but there are still nations out there, and I believe Canada is maybe still one of them, who have yet to approve that. This declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples is a great document that we should all support, and if we live in areas where these rights are not respected, I hope we will do an effort to be part of a process that can make sure that the country and the nation, the society where we live, will actually subscribe and adopt the Declaration of Rights on Indigenous peoples.
I just put a slide up with some of the key provisions, and Jorn, I'm really pleased to be able to say that Canada has now endorsed the UN Declaration. It was Canada had been very involved in the drafting of the declaration in the early 2000s, and then there was a change in government, and when the Conservative government came in, they rejected the declaration, but after the latest change in government in 2015, Canada went to the UN and expressed its unqualified support for the declaration. And actually just at the end of the last parliamentary session, legislation was passed to implement the declaration in the context of Canadian law, which means that Canada will be reviewing all of its laws and policies to bring them into alignment with the declaration. So that's a fairly recent development here, but something that a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues have worked on for many, many years. And if you want to read the full declaration, I posted the link in the Facebook group. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah,
I have a very operational question. So in Guatemala, whenever there are efforts to try and support and pursue Indigenous rights, everybody goes to the ILO 169, which in my ignorance, I did not know about this declaration on rights of Indigenous peoples, and I'm surprised that we wouldn't, and I'm reading that Guatemala is, the countries that haven't signed are so few that Guatemala has to be among the ones that have signed. I'm interested, I don't know if you guys can tell me what is the difference between the ILO 169 and this. And this looks that it's much more complete. And anyway, do you have any news about that? I'm ignorant.
I'm not sure I understand the distinctions that well either.
Okay.
I'm more familiar with the UN Declaration. The OAS has also been working on a declaration for the Americas for many, many years, but it's, I think, yet to be finalized and fully endorsed. I think one of the interesting things about the declaration, and that's gotten a lot of attention in this country, that, you know, I can't believe I'm focusing on this because my frustration is it's not just about resource development and free, prior, and informed consent, which is very much the conversation here around the development of pipelines and other things. I think there's a lot of other important provisions in the declaration around the rights of Indigenous people to be involved in decision-making in areas that affect them and so on. But I think that's something, and I'd be curious, maybe a last question for Yarn and for Catherine as well, if you have views, but on the balance between economic development and you know, responsible development in the sense that Indigenous people both benefit from, you know, can build their economy, but also in a way that respects the land and protects the land for future generations. And we had a really interesting Supreme Court decision in Canada a few years ago on it. We've got 30 years of jurisprudence on Indigenous rights now, but talked about, you know, it being incumbent on Indigenous people to protect the land for the benefit and use of future generations. And so I know it's something a lot of our communities and nations struggle with, is finding that balance. And Jorn, I know you've been involved both on the government side and in building the economy, and I thought maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think it's one of the most important issues, because if you don't have a say or proper involvement in the economic development of your own areas, then it's really just symbolic politics you will be doing. But the rest of it will then be at the mercy of someone else, and you never want to be in such a situation. So it's absolutely key for all Indigenous peoples, I think, to be directly involved in any form of economic development that happens within their areas. And of course, this can take form in very different models and processes, but most importantly, I think it's key that Indigenous peoples of a particular area is involved in every level of the development process, and that they are also to a larger extent co-owners of any of the projects that are being developed utilizing their land and their resources. And of course, in Greenland, we hope that our vast hydro potential and mineral potentials will that we can utilize these in a manner that will help develop a more sustainable and more green world, to put it in a very basic manner. But the key thing is that decisions of development like that should be not done alone with the informed consent, but also with informed consent and participation. Because if we don't participate directly, then we live at the mercy of someone else, and that's not good.
Thanks, Yarn. And I see, Catherine, did you want to add? If not,
I'll just add
go
one
ahead.
thing from an academic perspective too. One of the things that we've done at Memorial is we've created a new policy around research impacting Indigenous groups. And similarly, a lot of research that has been done by academic institutions has a lot of times been on Indigenous peoples, not by and with Indigenous peoples, but have been the subject. Indigenous peoples have long been the subject. and Lucy, I'm sure you're familiar with this too, like across the north, Northerners, Inuit and Indigenous peoples in the north have just, it's been very extractive. And so what we're looking at is that research should be, Indigenous people should be involved in what kind of research happens with them in their communities, on their lands. And similarly, you know, when we talk about resources and resource development, I think just things around research should certainly involve Indigenous peoples as well. So the policy basically is that, you know, any research that is done is done in consultation with Indigenous peoples at the concept development stage. So researchers aren't creating their research project and then going out and looking for Indigenous peoples to partner with, that the concept is developed alongside Indigenous peoples.
Thanks. So Constance had a question in the chat. This is probably the last one we have time for before we get invaded by the teenagers. But she said, I wonder how the pandemic has affected Indigenous peoples and access to services. I can speak to that quickly given some of the work I do. So, you know, Indigenous Services Canada is responsible for providing you know, health or support. We primarily we fund and communities and community organizations provide, but health, education, social services. And so it was quite a challenge in the beginning. I remember I spent the first 3 weeks of the pandemic trying to figure out how to move our nursing staff from, you know, who live all across the country. It's mostly a mobile workforce. When one of the major airlines stopped flying that we used to rely on to move people to get into remote communities. And, you know, we ended up in 3 weeks building a charter airline so that they could bring nursing shifts in and out and that the nurses wouldn't have to travel through commercial airports and potentially be exposed, you know, to infected people on their way into a community, because the last thing we wanted to do was have our staff bringing the virus into communities. Nationally, another important aspect was because of the you know, risk factors that Indigenous people face: overcrowded housing, lack of access to clean drinking water and water for hand washing and cooking in a lot of communities, you know, chronic health conditions and respiratory diseases, things that would make them particularly vulnerable, put them at a higher risk. Across Canada, in every province and territory, Indigenous people were given among the first priority for vaccine access. And so we had a really successful vaccination campaign where Indigenous people were vaccinated, and including in urban centers as well, were able to get access to the vaccine. We did have some, and so the first wave we managed pretty well. And in that there was less prevalence in Indigenous communities than others. But then as the second and third waves rolled in, we did have some quite large outbreaks in communities and particularly in the prairies, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta. We had some really challenging situations. And then you add in, you know, the complications of climate change and flooding season and forest fires, and where communities in some cases had to be evacuated. And that meant taking them out of their remote community where they were relatively safe and not exposed into urban centers. So among the things, you know, communities did to try to mitigate that, there's a community in Northern Ontario where every spring they're built on a floodplain. Almost every year the community has to evacuate. So this year, rather than moving them south to Timmins, Ontario, the community opted to evacuate to the land. And so they went out on the land into their traditional camps and isolated there until the flooding season had passed. So again, it was, you know, relying on Indigenous ways of knowing and being to help mitigate some of the effects of the pandemic. Yarn and Catherine, I don't know if there's anything you want to share from your community's experience.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yes, I think in Greenland we have been very fortunate by the fact that we have had some very strict restrictions from the beginning. So in total, we have experienced 249 people getting COVID. Out of those, 151 are all well. 98 are still sick. Only 2 are hospitalized, and until now, none have died. And in terms of the vaccinations, right now, 68% of the population have been vaccinated at least once, and 53% of the population have been fully vaccinated. So I think we are doing well, and we feel very, very blessed that we have not been hit any harder, but we are also taking very strict precautions whenever there is a small outbreak anywhere.
And I'll just say that for Inuit in Nunatsiavut, it's a lot of Inuit died during the Spanish flu in 1918, a lot. It wiped out communities and families, and there's a film done in the 80s called The Last Days of Okuk. And so, you know, I have friends whose grandparents survived, and so like it's in living memory. So it was a really, really scary time for a lot of communities and a lot of people, and it for the communities in the region I grew up, they're still only fly-in communities. So there are no roads going into the communities, and a lot of people just shut everything down. So no people coming in, and only people that needed to travel for hospital or other reasons actually did travel. But thankfully, you know, I don't think there was one case of COVID in any of the community, nor in Inuit communities in Northern Labrador.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I think maybe this is probably a good point to draw it to a close. It's 8:25, and Amy Grant's Sun River is about to host a hangout. So if you've got teenagers at home who want to complain about their parents and how, you know, how annoying we all are because of our UWC experience, you can have them join back in on this link. I'm going to pour myself a glass of wine and head over to Gathertown. So I'll be there in about 5 minutes if people want to chat further and continue the conversation. Want to thank you all. This has been an amazing turnout. Really, really great to see the level of interest and to see so many familiar faces. And now I do want to just talk to you all kind of one-on-one and say hi. I saw Eddie was here and lots of people I haven't seen in forever. So that's been really fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. So great to finally meet you in person. We'll have to chat offline sometime because I'm sure we know 100 of this, hundreds of the same people from back home. And Yarn, it was great to see you again. Yarn and his family came to visit me in Ottawa about, I guess, 5 years ago, and our kids had a ball, and it was really great to see him and meet his wife Vivian and talk about some of these issues around the dinner table, which was great. So thank you all. Look forward to seeing you at other events during the week. So good night and take care.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.